we've gotten some questions from people who have taken the emotional competency course. And so I thought it would be worth address those issues. There are really two questions that have been asked. One is a technique question, which is why do we ignore the word? And the second question is more of a definitional question, which is around affect and emotion. Let's start with affect and emotions. And what I've got my slides up, and let me just go through that with you, and then we can talk about, and I'll go through it quickly because a lot of people have seen this before, but for those who haven't, it's going to be a good introduction to the topic. So first of all, let me bring the slideshow up. Is when I go out and look around the web and see what people are talking about when they're talking about emotional intelligence, what I find is nobody finds emotions. I haven't found one website yet that has a clear scientific definition of emotions. And I think that's kind of amazing. If you're claiming to teach people emotional intelligence and you can't define exactly what emotions are, then what are you doing? I do have a definition, and of course it's not my definition. This definition comes from neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, who is a leading neuroscientific researcher of emotions, and she is at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. And this is her definition. Emotions are biologically based patterns of perception, experience, physiology, action, and communication that are culturally created in our brain. That's a lot. To distill this down to what it really means is that we are not born with emotions. This is shocking to a lot of people. We are not born with emotion. We're born with something called affect, which I'll talk about in a moment. We actually have to create emotions in our brains at a very young age, starting when we start to verbalize at about 18 months. And emotions are simply taking different the combinations of various affective experiences that we experience and combining them into a cognitive concept that we can describe as a certain kind of feeling that we're having in the moment, describe it verbally. So let's dig into this a little deeper, and I'll try to roll through this quickly so as to not take up all our time. But basically, all emotion is based on affect. We're born with affect. We are not born with emotion. Affect is the general sense of feeling that you experience throughout the day. You can feel good, you can feel bad, you can feel angry. We'll look at there are 9 basic affects, and we'll look at those in just a second. But it has 2 components. The first is called valence. So affect is either positive, or it's neutral, or it's negative. And it has arousal. So it can be small arousal, moderate arousal, or high arousal. And when you take the combination of all of these 9 different affects and add in different levels, different types of valence, 3 different kinds of valence, and different levels of arousal, you have a palette of feelings, physical feelings that we experience that we then learn how to convert into the concept of emotion. So there are 9 basic affects, divided into positive, neutral, and negative. The positive ones are interest, excitement. The second one is happiness, joy. Neutral is surprise, startle, and surprisingly, of the 9 affects, 6 of them are negative. Fear, terror, distress, anguish, anger, rage, disgust, the smell, that's the feeling we get when we smell spoiled milk, and shame and humiliation. This is from the work of Sylvan Tompkins, who was a 1960s psychologist who was way ahead of his time and studied affect in infants and determined that babies have these 9 different affects, these different feelings that they experience, and they show them in more sophisticated ways as they grow in age until about 18 months, in which case then they have to start learning how to take these affects and categorize them into emotions. So you can just see very quickly, you can just see that we have all different combinations of valence and arousal. As I said, all emotions are based on affect. Emotion, when there's a process, we have to go through a developmental process of emotional categorization. And what that means is that we take basic affect and we turn it into an emotional experience. And when that happens, 4 things happen. The first is that when we emotionally categorize these combinations of feelings, this palette of feelings that we have, it transforms those feelings or that core affect into an intentional state where we can now bring it into our consciousness. And when we bring it into our consciousness, we can do a couple of really interesting things. And no other species on the planet can do this. Only humans can do this. And only humans, so far as we know, have emotions. And you'll see why in just a moment. First of all, when we can concretize core affect into our consciousness, into an intentional state, we can now draw inferences about what caused us to have the feelings that we're having. Why am I angry? Why am I scared? Why am I frustrated? And I can look around and start drawing cause and effect conclusions. Mostly it's wrong. Most of the time it's wrong, but still it's a very powerful evolutionary adaptation that allows us to figure out, why am I feeling this way? And then it tells us what to do next. So if I'm really angry, that means there's a boundary violation and I have to maybe protect myself. And finally, and most importantly, when we concretize affect into emotion, it permits us to communicate our emotional experience to another person. So these are all very powerful aspects of emotional categorization. And the sad thing is that our society is so biased against emotion that we don't train children how to develop emotional categorization. The way we train children to develop emotional competency is to validate their emotional experience. But instead we emotionally invalidate. Every child has been emotionally invalidated, and that is extremely abusive, and it stunts the emotional categorization process. There's also a process known as emotional granularity, and this is where we are able to refine our emotions from affect into very specific emotional states. So we define emotional granularity as the ability to express emotional experience with great precision. And as you can see, we can start with a negative affect, such as anger, and then it can lead, we can subdivide anger into frustration, irritation, annoyance, aggravation. We could go rage, hostility. I mean, there are all kinds of different levels of anger emotions that we can describe. And the more granular we become, the more emotionally competent we become. The less emotionally aware we are, the less able we are to categorize our emotions, to granularize our emotions, the less emotionally aware, self-aware we are, and the more reactive we are. So one of the great challenges of growing up is learning how to be emotionally competent, and we are frustrated and thwarted in that process as children because of this process of emotional invalidation. This is a little complex, but let me just explain it very briefly. So the core affects are in here. There's one in here that's not a core affect called disrespected, but I added that in. But the rest of these are the basic core affects that we have. The only one I don't have in here is this smell, but I've got disgust. And then you can see that in the inner circle, we start to categorize these affects into more specific emotions. So for example, with anger, we can say frustrated, jealous, hate, rage, a continuum. Or for shame, we can say humiliated, guilty, embarrassed. So we're starting to subdivide. And there are differences between shame, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. And then when we go to the outer wheel, you can see that we get very, very specific and very granular. So if we go over here to shame, we can say under humiliated, we've got chastened, disgraced, mortified, disrespected, ridiculed. Under guilty, it could be blameworthy, accountable, responsible, at fault. Remorseful, embarrassed could be uncomfortable, sheepish, ashamed, red-faced, awkward, self-conscious, stupid. And those are all words that express various gradations of the emotional experience of embarrassment, which itself is rooted in the root affect of shame, humiliation. That's the relationship between affect and emotion. And it becomes an important concept when we're affect labeling, because the more specific we can be with the words that we use to either label our own emotional experience or to label somebody else's experience, the more granular we can be, the more precise we can be, the more likely it is that we're going to touch on whatever it is that people are experiencing. Something else I've learned, and that is that when you are affect labeling, sometimes if you jump in and hit these core affects, the real basic stuff, it's too much for people. They're frightened by it. It's too scary. You see them too clearly. And so you get pushback. Oh, who do you think you are, my therapist? But if you start on the outside of the wheel where it's more refined, oftentimes you're not going to get that kind of pushback. So over a period of time, obviously learning all of this is, I mean, everybody knows all these words, but the ability to call them up and utilize them when you are affect labeling somebody, reading their emotions, it's more challenging. So one of the tasks, of course, is to start linking up your vocabulary of emotions, which is quite extensive, to actual feelings so that you can draw on it, you can call on it instantly when you're dealing with emotional people.